So how might we think historically about the Ukraine war and its impact on the international order? I think, one of the big problems we've been facing with the war, at least intellectually, how to understand it, is that so many of our pundits and our commentators keep going back to the Cold War. That this, they say, is a product of the Cold War. Not only is it a product of the Cold War, it indicates a return to the Cold War. Now, this seems to be a bit obsessive and narcissistic because it assumes that global history is entirely Western history and that Western history just repeats itself and no one else has anything but a walk-on part in that history. I don't think any of that is true. I don't think the Cold War is the model for this, partly because, of course, Russia is not the Soviet Union. It is not a superpower. This is not a superpower conflict. This is something quite different. The world has changed. But also, I think the Cold War analogy really makes no sense because the real precedent is what everyone chooses to forget, the global war on terror. It's very nice to remember a precedent in which the West has won, supposedly, the Cold War. Those are only the kinds of precedents that, by the way, are remembered. Everyone reaches for precedent like the Second World War, the First World War. All these precedents are precedents of Europe or the West winning their war. The global war on terror, was it won or was it lost? It's not clear what happened. But let me say why I think it really is the precedent here. One, it's a precedent because for the first time since the war on terror, you have this effort to basically dragoon and round up everyone in the whole world and include them as participants in some way in this conflict. You're for us or you're against us. That's a very war on terror language as we know. It worked in the war on terror. It doesn't seem to be working today. That's an interesting side note. The second reason why I think the war on terror is a precedent is because with the Ukraine war too, you see a conflict which was devastating, just as the 9/11 attacks were devastating, being made into an opportunity for a remaking of the West and a remaking of the world. That I think is clear in Ukraine. Ukraine is, in addition to itself, is an opportunity for the remaking of the world, and everyone says this. US world order, what to do with China after Russia, etc., etc., etc. Now, the interesting side note here is that this opportunity has only come into play after the failure of the last opportunity, which is the opportunity offered by 9/11 and, as it were, taken on the road with the global war on terror. So this is not a good track record. You have one failure and now you want to try again to do something slightly different. So that's the second precedent. There is a third one, and I think probably the most serious one, which is that what the global war on terror did was to finally destroy the lineaments of the international order altogether. Remember, a lot of this was preemptive attacks, illegal by international law standards sanctions, covert operations, drones, etc., etc., etc. Laws of war were broken. Now, what's really interesting, I think, here is that this breaking of the law makes us realize how much international law was indeed a creation of the Cold War itself, like the United Nations, which sits as a crown jewel on top of our ideas of international law. So the entire post-war order was founded largely during the Cold War, and it's been destroyed in the wake of the Cold War, the global war on terror being, if you will, the coup de grace of this destruction. Now, once you have this destruction, what are you going to do? How are you going to actually deal with the Ukraine conflict? Well, we know how it's been dealt with. You have the usual sanctions, grabs of sovereign wealth, and all the rest, none of which conform to any version of international law. And what has happened, in fact, is international law has been replaced by this strange phrase called the rules-based international order. It's important that it's called the rules-based international order, a phrase with a number of words in it where law finds no place, because there's nothing legal about it. This rules-based international order has just been come up with by certain Western states and has been, as it were, forced onto others. Now, Putin himself, hardly an observant figure as far as international law is concerned, even he realized this. A few months ago, he made the statement at the Valdai Club in Moscow saying, what we want is a return to international law. We don't want this thing called the rules-based international order. The problem, of course, is that Putin, like everyone else, is also, in his current avatar as a politician, a product of the war on terror. He too is doing preemptive attacks, and what he's been doing in Georgia and now in Ukraine is what the Americans and British have been doing in the Middle East, Central Asia, etc. It's the same logic, it's the same reasoning, it makes use of the same vocabulary of terror. And of course, in Putin's case, it's also Nazism, so it's dredging up yet another sort of European historical precedent. So we are faced with a really unusual situation in which we cannot possibly talk about the return of another Cold War. What we are dealing with is the fragmentation and destruction of the international order altogether. Where is the United Nations today? Where is the International Court? Where is, even the old Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, are not what they used to be, partly because they're alternatives largely in Asia, but also because they no longer really control the narrative. And I think this is probably the most important takeaway, however this war ends. And in a way, it doesn't matter whether Russia loses or America wins or the reverse. There is no winning and losing in this war. I think the real takeaway is that either we are going to descend into a kind of form of international anarchy, or we are going to get blocks appearing. In either case, the real imperative will be to stitch back again, to stitch into place a new vision of international law, because you can't have an international order without that. And I think if the West was serious about the opportunity offered by this war, it is not simply to, as it were, demonstrate the superiority over everyone else, but to do what their own recent ancestors did at the end of the Second World War, which is work with their opponents, as the United States worked with the Soviet Union, to actually put back into place another version of international law, this time one that will include rising new powers which were not included in the Second World War, in the post-war vision of international law. Otherwise, what we have is what we have, which is to say, a large number of countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America voting with their feet, basically. They don't have to be either pro-American or pro-Russian. They're just not part of this story. They refuse to either vote in the United Nations against Russia, not because they love Russia, but because they have their own interests. They will continue to trade with Russia and buy Russian oil, or they refuse to line up with Western Europe and the United States on this war. Again, not for ideological reasons. This is not superpower conflict Mac 2. They have not gone over to the communist camp. There is no communist camp. Now, that I think is truly extraordinary. You have the United States especially today representing an unprecedented incarnation of power globally. It's never been so powerful in its history. And yet, despite this, small and medium-sized countries are just refusing to play, are just refusing to tag along. They don't want to be America's enemies, but they just don't want to be part of the story. And I think that really is the true story and the true takeaway. The world is changing. Small and medium-sized powers are playing a much more important role in it. And we really need to think about reconstituting an international order in which all of these actors really have a place at the table.